Good morning, everyone. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, coming to you from the great state of Texas. Steeler fan though I am, and it's great to be back with you. Lots of great topics today with lots of great guests. We've got a great show coming up for you here today. I got to tell you, though, one of the most interesting stories I think we have is that I finally found a politician who speaks for me. And this is, it's almost stunning how completely Spencer Cox, governor of Utah, managed to crystallize everything I feel about the latest CDC guidelines on masks. Look, I was masking early in this pandemic. I'm a big believer in the vaccines. I think that you should clearly take whatever steps you can to mitigate against reasonable risk with COVID-19. However, I don't think that it's incumbent on us to mitigate against the risks that other people assume. And Spencer Cox is right with us on this. It's a short clip, but it's a great clip. Let's go to clip number 6.
The CDC is asking all of you who are vaccinated to take one for the team once again to protect people who are not vaccinated, but who have the opportunity to do so. Also, I'm guessing that the Venn diagram of people who are vaccinated or unvaccinated and willing to wear a mask is very, very slim, if at all. And so I'm grateful that there are people who are willing to sacrifice and wear masks again to protect the unvaccinated. I got to be honest with you. I don't know if I'm one of those people. I'm really tired. I'm really done with it. And I'm not real excited to have to sacrifice to protect someone who doesn't seem to care.
Exactly.
Amen.
Amen, Spencer Cox. Preaching it to the world right there. Look, I mean, and Dwayne and I have been joking around about this. I think Spencer Cox just vaulted to the top of the 2024 Republican presidential nomination
certainly top 5.
He's up there.
Number 5 with a bullet.
And, I mean, he struck the perfect tone here. Hey, I appreciate if you're willing to do this. That's great. Really not. I'm kind of done with this. If people want to take that kind of risk, let them take that kind of risk. I have indemnified myself as far as I possibly can against that risk, and now it's time to go live our lives.
As all of you should as well.
And all of you should as well. If you're not vaccinated, go get vaccinated. If you're not vaccinated and you're not going to get vaccinated, then stay masked up until this Delta wave has crested and has started to fall, and that may be coming a little sooner than we think. We'll have a little bit more on that later in the show. But if you're not going to do either one of those two things, well, then it's all on you, baby. I don't know what to tell you.
Not my problem.
It has gone from an MP to a YP. It's not a my problem anymore. It's a your problem. It's not even an OP. It's not even an our problem. It's your problem. And Spencer Cox, I think, hits the nail right on the head.
It's certainly not a GP, a government problem.
Well, it shouldn't be a government problem. However, we have more clips for you to explain to you who does think it's a GP. Dwayne, I mean, we got a whole bunch of this over the last 24 hours. People are still talking about this. Leading the way is His Honor himself, the second worst politician in the great state of New York. Mayor Bill de Blasio.
And by the way, Kaiser Wilhelm?
Yes, second by a long gap now, as we are discovering. I mean, if you had to tell me at the beginning of last year that I would think that Bill de Blasio is not the worst politician in New York, I would have been stunned. Of course, we know that that's the case, but he's still trying. He's number 2 and trying harder, Dwayne.
Yes.
Let's listen to Bill de Blasio in cut number 3.
Right now, we have to fight COVID like never before. The Delta variant has changed the game. Unless we want to run the risk of going back to restrictions and having our freedom taken away and people losing their jobs again, it's really clear what we have to do. People have to get vaccinated. And we had a long period where it was voluntary, there was incentives, it was compassionate and kind. But now it's time to get a little blunter about the fact that everyone needs to get vaccinated for the good of their family, their community, their country. And a lot of people, I think, are close to that point, but they needed a little more of a push. So here's a clear message. We're saying you want to go and enjoy great restaurants? Amen. You want to go to movie theaters, go to the gym. That's great. We want all that. You got to get vaccinated. You want to work in those places? You got to get vaccinated for the good and the health of everyone around you as well. It's not that tough to do. We say just get the first vaccination and you're in. Come back later, obviously get that second one when it's time. Now, here's the bottom line. We've heard from lots of folks in the business community. They said amen. They said this is really helpful because it makes the rules clear. And it's the way to stop COVID once and for all. Joe Biden said clearly he'd like to see more people do this. I'm urging mayors, governors, county executives, just do it, because this is how we're going to get that final push of vaccination we need to end the COVID era once and for all. And bluntly, Willie, I think if you're doing the right thing by everyone else around you and getting vaccinated, then you should enjoy everything in life. But if you are not getting vaccinated, then you're not going to be able to do some of the things you love. And our young people in particular, I guarantee, as the father of two 20-somethings, young people don't want to be left out of restaurants, bars, concerts. This is the kind of thing that's going to inspire a lot of young people to just get out there and get vaccinated.
So who did he just say can't be part of New York society?
The unvaccinated.
Which a large part is who again?
Oh, it's a fairly broad spectrum of
yes,
people.
It is.
But in New York, I mean, how many deep red Southern conservatives are there in New York? I mean, just
4.
4 maybe, right? So I mean, it's not really a big issue here. Where they're having problems getting traction are in some of the minority communities, and because there is a certain level of mistrust of government intervention in those communities. So Bill de Blasio is basically
wait. He's asking for people in the minority community to prove that they're vaccinated. They have to show some sort of proof that they're vaccinated.
That's what a passport. That's what a vaccine passport means, man. That's what a vaccine passport means.
Well, here's my proof. See, it says who I am.
And if that's the case, then great. But those CDC cards were never intended for that purpose. They weren't even created for that purpose.
So
they're not suited for that purpose.
So how do we make sure that says I'm who I am?
You need another form of ID to say, oh,
no.
By the way, let me match this up. And so, all those people who couldn't go to Kinko's, wasn't that the argument?
Yes.
People don't know how to go to Kinko's
so
to get an
you're
ID.
telling me that Bill de Blasio is asking minorities in New York to show ID to be able to take part in New York society?
Is that what he's saying? Not just that. But you need to be able to show ID so that your families aren't separated. Let's go to the other clip with Bill de Blasio.
Yeah, listen very closely to this cut.
Very short, but it's important.
Very close. Cut 4.
We welcome kids, of course, to restaurants and movie theaters, et cetera. Wear a mask. That's a smart thing to do. And hopefully soon our 5 to 11-year-olds will be eligible for vaccination on top of that. But we don't want to separate families. We want families to enjoy stuff together, but in a safe environment.
Wait. Stop. I thought separating families was bad. I mean, why is he even bringing that up? Who's talking about separating families?
Who asked to separate families? You have to go into a restaurant instead of the smoking and non-smoking section. It's now the vaccinated and unvaccinated section.
I don't even know where to begin with this. Nobody's even suggesting this as an issue. First off, children that young are simply not vectors for this disease. Not even in the Delta wave. There is some concern about teenagers, but kids 5 to 12 aren't vectors for this disease. This is the nonsense that you get. There's 2 factors going into this. One is authoritarianism, which this pandemic has just unleashed. And the second is this nonsense about we need to regulate down to zero risk. There is no such thing as zero risk. There's no such thing as zero risk in life.
Never will be.
Never will be. You can't regulate risk out of your choices. And that risk is something that people have to make decisions on. And if government's trying to indemnify against the risky choices that people are making by not getting vaccinated, by forcing everybody else to bend around that, then you're eliminating at least some of the incentive to go out and get vaccinated.
We don't want to have to separate your families.
This is nonsense.
De Blasio's basically saying it's a nice family you have. Shame something happened to it.
And bear in mind, with all this that we just said, Bill de Blasio is still only the second worst politician in the great state of New York. Later on in the show, we'll probably get to the first worst politician in the great state of New York. So stay tuned for that. I'm Ed Morrissey, filling in for Hugh Hewitt. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com. Moving on up to guest host for Hugh Hewitt today and tomorrow, and talking a little bit about the moratorium on evictions. And the Washington Post editorial board came out and said, golly, we think this might be illegal. Golly, you think? Joining us to discuss this is Rich Lowry, editor of National Review, author of The Case for Nationalism, at Rich Lowry on Twitter. Rich, welcome to the show.
Hey, how's it going?
Well, it's not going so well. I'm not sure what it means when the Washington Post editorial board agrees with me. Of course, they're also agreeing with objective reality, Rich, which apparently is escaping the White House and some of the Democrats here with this eviction moratorium. This is it's one thing to say, look, I don't think that I think that we have legitimate authority to do this. It's another thing to say, yeah, we know that this is illegal. We're going to do it anyway. I mean, this is how do you even justify something like that when your oath of office requires you to uphold and defend the Constitution?
Yeah. I mean, he's admitting that he is affirmatively violating his sworn duty to uphold the Constitution. And I give the Washington Post credit. At least one of his allies is criticizing this, but the rest are just pocketing the gain. At the same time, they say, the Texas voting law, because there's no longer be drive-through voting, is authoritarianism and a violation of our democracy. At the same time, every Tucker Carlson monologue is supposedly Democratic backsliding. And here you have the President of the United States defying our constitutional order, trampling on the prerogatives of Congress, and basically violating what, in effect, was the verdict of the people's representatives. Because Nancy Pelosi tried to pass this extension through the House. 12 House Democrats or so said no, and that's why it didn't happen. So that's democracy. Those are our representatives. They've spoken. And for the president just to go and defy the will of the people's representatives is totally outrageous. And it just tells you everything you need to know, that people like Greg Sargent and Jonathan Chait are always going on about the threat of authoritarianism. As far as I can tell, haven't said a cross word about this. They don't care about a president violating our Constitution.
Well, at least the newspaper that says democracy dies in darkness managed to cover the news this time. This is part of this whole hysteria from the previous 4 years of how democracy was on a knife's edge because Donald Trump was president. I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of Donald Trump, but if this had happened, if Donald Trump had done this precise series of events, they would have been screaming out loud. In fact, they were screaming out loud about Donald Trump redirecting funds that had already been appropriated to the Department of Defense for building the border wall, right? I mean, and they were talking about that as being authoritarian and undermining the rule of law. That wasn't even illegal. I mean, courts ruled on that.
At least a colorable, even if you take a hostile view of that, at least a colorable legal case. And what I always said, I thought that violated the spirit of the law. I didn't know whether it necessarily was illegal.
I actually agree with
itself.
that.
But you had 10 Senate Republicans or so voting against it on that basis, where you have Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, and this is where James Madison would just be completely confounded because he thought each branch would be jealous of its power. Instead, here you have Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer spent their entire careers climbing to the apex of the legislative branch that's supposed to pass the laws. When they can't pass the laws, they urge the president to violate the constitutional order and trample on Congress to get done what they want to get done. And that's Madison just would his jaw would be open. He just wouldn't know how to process that.
I think if you go back and look at some of the arguments in the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalists, I think that you see hints of this in their deep suspicion of political parties, right? Because I think that they were concerned about the interests of the political parties trumping what are the natural interests, the natural constitutional interests of each of the branches. And I think it maybe took 200 years or so for us to get to this point. But certainly the 17th Amendment had something to do with this, Rich, where we made the Senate a direct election rather than appointments through state legislatures, or at least mandated that they be directly elected at that point. At which point they became just another party office to be claimed. And I think as the two parties have moved from at least some regional interests into almost completely now ideological coalitions, that we're seeing the fruition of this, where there really isn't any true tension between two different branches of the federal government if the same party holds both of those branches.
Yeah,
and that's true with Republicans, too.
Those are all really good points. I think another thing that's playing in here is the pervasive view, it's kind of become conventional wisdom, and we all fall prey to this, that the Supreme Court decides. And that's sort of what Joe Biden is saying. The Constitution, I don't have anything to do with the Constitution. We'll just throw this out here. I think it's probably illegal. It'll probably be struck down by the courts. But let the courts deal with it. That's not the way it's supposed to work. Every elected official, all of us, have an obligation to uphold the Constitution. It's supposed to be much broader than just one branch of government, but we've moved away from that view.
And Rich, I mean, specific now more to the eviction moratorium here, this is probably not a very good policy. That still really needs to have some sort of a rational wind down. I mean, you can't just let this thing collapse. And because bad policy has its own consequences, you have to deal with the consequences of bad policy. And I'll give the previous Congress, some grace on this, because they're facing an unprecedented pandemic with unprecedented consequences. They were trying to find ways to deal with this, and without having millions of people suddenly have to be transiting between different places to find housing. And that made some sense, even if it was probably overall not terribly advisable to do it in the way they did it. At this point, Congress needs to have some sort of a rational wind down, some sort of an off-ramp for this. And Congress had 32 days. I mean, Justice Kavanaugh stayed a decision. It wasn't a decision, but he stayed a lower court decision on this for 32 days to allow Congress to do that, right? They said, well, this is not, we can't have this moratorium. It's not constitutional, but I'm going to give Congress an extra month here to do something rational with this. At which point Congress immediately jumped on this. Well, that's not true. It took Congress 30 days to even start to address this. So you made the mention of this. And again, we're speaking with Rich Lowry of NationalReview.com, author of The Case for Nationalism, at Rich Lowry on Twitter. They waited 30 days to get to this, and the reason why they didn't have anything to put on the floor is because nobody had done any of the work. The White House hadn't done any of the work. House Democrats hadn't done any of the work. Nobody had been talking about this until I believe it was either Maxine Waters or Cori Bush cornered Nancy Pelosi on the floor of the House and told her that they needed to do something about this. This is a failure of leadership in both Congress and the White House. That's the reason why we're in this position.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think you can argue with Kavanaugh because there are four conservatives who said, you know what, it's unconstitutional. We're going to uphold this lower court stay, and it should just end, and then let everyone else figure it out. And Kavanaugh's, no, let's give Congress more time, and I think the four others are probably correct. But anyway, he gives them more
I agree.
additional time, and they do nothing with it. And even if they had moved on this more expeditiously, it sounds as though there just wasn't support because there were a dozen Democrats or so who thought it was bad policy. And even if you think people still need rent support, this isn't the way to go about it because it really screws the landlords. What you want to do is put money in the hands of the renters and have them pay their landlords, or at least support the landlords. My understanding, I think Pelosi mentioned this on the House floor. They passed a program, I don't know, $30 billion or something. I might be making up the numbers, but almost none of the money went out the door, which also is a classic Washington thing. The big so-called COVID relief bill earlier this year. How much of that has been spent? Right? They're using a lot of it for the bipartisan infrastructure deal because it's just sitting there because they just were firing money out of a cannon without any regard to what was actually happening with it.
And I think actually you undershot that. It was $49 billion that has been appropriated through the three different COVID relief bills. Only $3 billion of which has been spent. Yeah. And Nancy Pelosi and the White House are pointing fingers at the governors for not moving this money around. But the governors have to have to comply with the rules and regulations attached to this. At the Department of Treasury, Janet Yellen is saying, well, look, I mean, Congress could expedite this by providing a little bit more structure. It's a mess, and it's a mess that Democrats have created, and it's a mess that Democrats are now trying to punt to each other. You've got Nancy Pelosi trying to punt it to the CDC and to the Biden White House. Biden initially was saying, well, it's the governors and it's Congress, and then he kind of backtracked on this. I mean, this may be worse than not doing anything, in that it's creating all this uncertainty around the rental markets, and investors are paying attention to this. And if the goal here is to get more affordable housing to people who need it, this is exactly the way you don't go about this, right, Rich?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is these kind of heroic interventions, as you mentioned earlier, March, April 2020, you can understand it.
Yep.
We're on the cusp of this crisis. We're shutting down most of the country, but we're coming out of that now, and we're experiencing robust growth, and it's time for this stuff to end. And we've seen that with the enhanced unemployment benefits. There's an argument about how much of an effect they have, but certainly at the margins, they make it less likely for people to go out and get employed, which is really important at all levels. It's important economically, it's important psychologically, it's important for people's future skills and earning power. So this is a whole other topic, obviously, but we're returning to normal, right? I mean, the Delta cases are spiking, but we're in a totally different situation than we were a year and a half ago, because 70% of the country, 70% of adults have at least one shot. And we just have no vocabulary or no way of absorbing that.
Rich Lowry from NationalReview.com. Thanks for being with us. At Rich Lowry on Twitter. I'm Ed Morrissey, filling in for Hugh Hewitt. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, filling in for Hugh Hewitt today. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Michael Oren, former Israeli Deputy Prime Minister for Diplomacy and former ambassador to the U.S., and at Dr. Michael Oren on Twitter. And along with a lot of other things, actually an excellent film critic. Dr. Oren, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you, Ed.
I just got done reading a really terrific critique of a new television series in Israel called The Beauty Queen of Jerusalem. And I mean, I think you missed your calling. This is an excellent essay here.
People don't know this. I have a whole Hollywood connection. I used to be Orson Welles' assistant. That's the weirdest thing going. No kidding.
I had no idea.
So it was a thing. I had to make a decision at an early age whether to stay in Hollywood or go into the Israeli paratroopers. And I figured, go into the paratroopers, I could always go back to Hollywood. But and I ended up staying. But yes, I have a particular interest in the interface between film, television programs, movies, politics, and the state of Israel. And so this is one of a series of reviews I've made over the course of, say, the last year. Just before this, I reviewed an extraordinary Australian series called A Place to Call Home, which is the most pro-Jewish, the most pro-Israel, and the most pro-religion series I've seen in years.
Well, that's interesting. You can't say that about the Beauty Queen of Jerusalem, unfortunately. And
No,
I mean, I'm
yeah.
reading through this, and you write so eloquently about this. And Dr. Oren, I mean, it's almost to me like the 1619 Project of Israel. I mean, this is something that completely changes the origin story of your country in ways that are that undercut it and do so dishonestly. I mean, every country has its good issues and bad issues, I guess you could say. I mean, nobody's perfect, but I mean, in this case, it really mischaracterizes what was going on in the time period that it's taking place, was between the Ottoman Empire and the founding of the State of Israel, and it does so in a way that really undercuts the whole reason for Israel's existence. And I found it extraordinary, as you're writing about this, I found it extraordinary that Israel actually has a Hollywood. I didn't know this.
No, Israel has a blooming Hollywood. I mean, the hit shows on American television, everything from Homeland to In Treatment to now Fauda, Tehran. These are all Israeli programs. And all the major studios have opened up offices here because everyone's hungry for content.
Right.
And I'm sure that this program, A Beauty Queen of Jerusalem, this series will make it onto American television. But it's going to give a profoundly distorted view of Israel's history. And it's a review that comes right out of the extreme Israeli left, which says that, the reason we have a conflict with the Palestinians is because the outcome of the 1948 war and the 1967 war. So it's about expulsion of Palestinians, about acquisition of Palestinian territory, capture of Palestinian territory by the Israeli army. And it's not a religious conflict. It's not a conflict that began in 1948, had nothing to do with the Holocaust. The British were great. They were terrific when they were here. These are all sort of left-wing tropes here. But they're wrong. And what history shows us was that the Palestinian-Arab attempt to destroy the Zionist project began 28 years before the state was formed in 1920, and that it was all around religion, about radical Islam and false claims that the Jews were trying to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and that the British officials were anti-Semitic, and Britain bore the responsibility for closing Palestine's door to the Jews of Europe, condemning them to death in the Holocaust in 1939. It's quite extraordinary. I watched this series with my mouth hanging open, not for good reasons.
Yeah, when I said Hollywood, that you have a Hollywood in Israel, I didn't mean it as an industry. I meant it more as a political point of view. Political.
I get it. Now I understand it. Okay.
Yeah, I feel for you because we've had it here for a very long time, and I'm sorry to see it showing up in Israel in this fashion. And it'd be one thing if this was entertaining, and you're also saying at the same time, it really isn't. It's not very well done on any level here, except for maybe cinematography. Maybe that's the only thing that's
not even. It's not a good series. It's just not a good series. There are some very good series that are just as bad. Watch Our Boys on HBO. Which the Israeli government has called an anti-Semitic series,
right?
Which is just horrible. And if you watch another series on Netflix called The Messiah, which is not an Israeli series, but it manages to touch every single anti-Semitic trope. Amazing.
It's amazing that this continues on, and I know that we only had a short time, but I really want to highlight this. It's at tabletmag.com. It just came up yesterday. The Beauty Queen of Jerusalem, The Beauty Queen of Jerusalem by Michael Oren. Make sure you read this. This is a really, I think, damaging way to look at this. If it gets to American shores, we should be inoculated against it, and Dr. Michael Oren has given us that inoculation. Thank you very much, Dr. Oren, for being with us. We'll be right back. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, filling in for Hugh. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, filling in for Hugh today and tomorrow. Having a great time being part of this fantastic audience here on the Salem Radio Network, and joining me on that as well is Stephen Gutowski of The Reload, is also at Stephen Gutowski on Twitter. He's been doing a great job of covering the nomination of David Chipman to run the ATF, and on David Chipman's background, and he has taken some slings and arrows for his hard work. Stephen, great to talk to you again.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So how does it feel to be the target of a national smear campaign in order to rescue a lobbyist that wants to join the government? I mean, it's almost amusing. It's amusing because I'm not the person who's stuck in this, but I mean, Stephen, at least people are noticing you.
Yeah, yes, that's true. At least the reporting is being read, so that's always good. It is certainly an odd phenomenon to be stuck in the middle of a fight between the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I've never experienced that before.
Well, let's talk about David Chipman. I mean, this all starts with David Chipman's nomination to run the ATF. David Chipman is a former ATF agent, but he's more than just that. He also was a lobbyist for the 4 years of the Trump administration for a gun control group. He was a paid lobbyist at one point earlier than that for Michael Bloomberg's Everytown group. This is a guy who is a gun control activist, and certainly that alone has created problems for his nomination. And then on top of this, you went back through the records, you were doing some digging, and found out that there were complaints about David Chipman's remarks about African American agents at the EEOC. Now, I would say that these remarks were probably not the most awful remarks one could make, but they certainly created enough of an issue to where people complained about them. You reported on it, and then what happened next?
Yeah, well, then the Republicans on the Senate Judiciary Committee called for a second hearing into Chipman to investigate these alleged comments that he's supposed to have made denigrating black agents. He claimed that too many had gotten through an assessment for promotion and that they must have cheated. That's what the allegation is. And so Republicans want a new hearing. Then the chairman, Dick Durbin, replied to the Republicans in a letter essentially attacking me and the Reload.com for reporting these allegations. And the latest is that the Republicans have sent another letter defending my reporting by name, which I guess is nice of them, but continuing to pursue a second hearing for Chipman.
And there's certainly precedent for this. I mean, they had a second hearing for Brett Kavanaugh for his confirmation hearing after allegations arose after the first hearing, and so there's certainly precedent that Democrats have set on that particular issue. But I mean, let's set this scene fully. First off, I've known Stephen for years, and Stephen's always done very careful work. He's always been a very careful researcher. He's always been a very careful reporter. I mean, nobody's perfect at this, but Stephen takes a lot of care. This is not a guy who is just running off at the mouth and throwing out allegations. This is a guy who does his homework, does the footwork, gets it down before he puts it out, and which you did. I mean, I don't think anybody who's attacking your reporting here is actually denying that that this complaint exists, right?
No, in fact, the existence of the complaints is not in dispute. Chipman has confirmed that there were at least 2 complaints against him. He claims that they were there was no repercussions over them, that they were resolved, but the dispute is over what's in the complaints,
right?
Which are these allegations that he made these comments. That's not confirmed, of course. That's what the dispute is over. Although no one has denied it. Durbin called it baseless, but didn't provide anything else besides saying that it's baseless. And Chipman himself hasn't responded at all to these allegations. Neither has the White House. So that we don't have a denial, and the complaints themselves are private. They're sealed, so they haven't been released to the public. So we can't see what's actually in them.
No, but you have talked to ATF agents on an anonymous basis to talk about what was, what the general gist of these complaints were, and about their own experiences with Chipman in these offices, and that's also part of your reporting is dealing with this. And the reason why these sources have wanted to remain anonymous is because they're afraid he's going to get confirmed, that Chipman will get confirmed by the Senate, and that retaliations will begin afterwards. Is that based on their earlier experiences with David Chipman as expressed to you, and at least in one case as expressed to the committee?
Yes. I spoke to one current official who was concerned that Chipman has apparently a reputation among some of the agents as a bit of a bully, and there's concern that when he becomes chairman, director, if he's confirmed, that he might retaliate against anyone he thinks is not on his side, I guess, or not on the same wavelength as him, especially when it comes to gun control advocacy, and that could lead to people being reassigned far away from where they live and having to uproot their families and things like that. So that and then also a lot of former agents often work as contractors in somehow related to the agency. So,
right.
There's good reason why they wouldn't necessarily want to speak up, although some of them or speak up on the record at the very least. But we did just have a group of retired agents, all of whom served at the time Chipman did and had more than 25 years of experience at the agency, and they signed their names to a letter opposing his nomination this week, where they were concerned that he doesn't have the temperament to lead the agency and that his gun control advocacy would actually be detrimental to agents being able to carry out their mission, because that often requires a relationship with gun dealers who tend to give a lot of the tips on, red flags that they see in terms of, gun running and things like that.
Well, you can read more of this at thereload.com, and of course, Stephen's at Stephen Gutowski on Twitter. But let's just recap where Chipman's nomination's at right now. The Judiciary Committee split on the nomination. It's a strict party line vote, and these are equal seats for both parties because of the way that the 50-50 split is in the Senate at the moment. So technically, they didn't advance the nomination. Chuck Schumer exercised his executive authority to pull that out of committee and at least prepare it for a vote on the Senate floor. But it doesn't look like that vote's going to be coming anytime soon. My understanding is that Angus King has decided that he's going to vote against Chipman, and there are no other Republicans. There are no Republicans, I should say, who are prepared to vote for Chipman. So is his nomination dead anyway?
It could be. Technically, he hasn't actually been discharged from the committee yet. Schumer could do that because.
Oh, I thought he had done that. Okay.
No, he hasn't done it yet. That's why the Republicans believe they could have a second hearing, because he's technically still in front of the committee until Schumer decides to put him on the floor. But yeah, he's waiting to do that until he knows he has 50 votes. And right now, the latest reporting from Politico is that King has told the White House he's a no on Chipman, although he hasn't said this publicly yet. So there's still hope among gun control advocates and Democrats that they could change Angus King's mind, as well as Joe Manchin and John Tester and some of the other Democrats who have yet to come out in support of him, because, they're going to need all 50.
They're going to need all 50 plus Kamala Harris. Stephen Gutowski, thanks for being with us. Go to thereload.com to find out more about the Chipman nomination and everything going on around it. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, filling in for Hugh. Welcome back. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, filling in for Hugh today and taking your calls at 800-520-1234. And joining us right now is Tevi Troy, historian, author, fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center. You can find him on Twitter at Tevi Troy. He's got a great well, this is from a couple of weeks ago, but it's really worth visiting here. I would say in the beginning of anybody's administration, but perhaps most especially Joe Biden's administration, about the foreign policy impact that Reagan's decision to fire striking air traffic controllers had. Just an excellent essay. It's published at the Washington Examiner. And Tevi, welcome back to the show. I really was impressed by this because while I very much remember the Patco issue and Reagan's firing event, what impact it had on domestic politics, I was really not aware of it having a particular impact on foreign policy.
Yeah, and thanks for having me on today. This is the 40th anniversary of Reagan firing the illegally striking federal air traffic controllers, and it did have a huge impact on foreign policy. The Soviets noticed. George Shultz, who was Secretary of State, later said it was the most important foreign policy decision of Reagan's presidency. And again, it was early in Reagan's presidency, as you say, and presidents should look on. And this is an example of how to act early in a term. People thought, maybe Reagan was a little feeble because he was older. He'd been shot recently. He was new. People said he was an actor. He didn't know what he was talking about. But he really showed some spine in this instance against a lot of pressure. At the time, Patco was a union that had endorsed Reagan. So there were real political implications. And nobody was taking on striking union workers, either government ones or non-government ones at the time. At the time, the U.S. was often paralyzed by strikes. And Reagan stood up to it, and it really made a difference, and people around the world noticed.
Yeah, and I think that context is important because, Reagan was considered a pretty tough governor when he was governor of California, but that had been, 7 years prior. He had finished up his second term 7 years prior to that. He was older. And like you said, he had just been shot. I mean, I think it would have been 4 months, just 4 months prior to that. He'd been shot. He was still recovering from that gunshot at the time. And certainly you would have had both friends and allies, both friends and foes alike around the world looking at whether or not the United States was prepared to respond to any sort of crisis, domestic or foreign. And this was really the first crisis that he confronted other than his own recovery after that assassination attempt.
Yeah, absolutely right. I'm glad you mentioned allies because Margaret Thatcher was watching very carefully also, and England had been paralyzed by strikes throughout the 1970s, and she took a tougher stance against these strikes domestically after that. And as well, she saw Reagan as a partner that she could work with on Cold War issues, and as you know, together they helped win the Cold War that decade.
Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and St. John Paul II, I think. Yeah, it was the triumvirate. Yeah, the holy trio that ended the Cold War. And this is, I think, one of the first steps that Reagan took, at least, in moving towards that. Certainly, John Paul II had already started staking out some of this ground by going back to Poland and challenging the Soviet structure there. But let's talk about that in the context of now. So that was 40 years ago, and it really did reset, I think, reassert America's dominant place in world leadership. It was a signal that we were planning on really flexing our muscles in a lot of different ways. And by the way, there was also an element of, and you mentioned this in your piece, that about dealing with Canada. Which is that the Canadian air traffic controllers tried doing a sympathy strike at one of their facilities, and Reagan pressured Canada into cracking down on that too. So I mean, it was clear that Reagan was going to be an active president at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. He was a tough president. He did say no dice when the Canadians tried some kind of a sympathy strike, and the Canadians backed down. Because they know how important U.S. allyship is. And people on both sides of the aisle noticed this as well. Tip O'Neill talked about how when he went to Moscow on a trip not long after, the Soviets had taken notice. And then also, I mentioned a very young senator named Joe Biden at the time.
Right.
And Biden said people like him. They want to go on fishing trips with Reagan. I mean, he couldn't have been more positive about Reagan in that interview not long after the striking workers were fired. So I think people on both sides of the aisle noticed, allies noticed, our enemies noticed, and it set the right tone for a presidency. Here's a president who was going to stand up for the right thing and stick with it. And I think it mattered, and that's why he had such a consequential presidency. So
let's extrapolate that out 40 years later. You've got Joe Biden. He's in his first year as president. He has not exactly signaled strength. I mean, he's trying to get the Iranians to come back to the table by relaxing sanctions against them. He's sort of protesting the attack on Israeli shipping. I mean, I know that Anthony Blinken is saying that we definitely know it was Iran, so that's not a bad thing. It's certainly good that we're recognizing that. But this hasn't been a presidency that has a lot of robust moments on foreign policy. They haven't had a lot of opportunity to flex yet either. So to be fair, what is it that Biden needs to do here? How does he take the lesson of Reagan and apply it? What's the application here that we should be looking for?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ed. And there's a telling anecdote in my piece where I talk about how Reagan was confronted with this issue, and his aides are warring at a cabinet meeting about what to do because it's a controversial issue. And Reagan sits there writing, in the words of Michael Deaver. And what he stops his aides fighting after about 50 minutes and says, fellas, hey, listen to what I've written here. And they read that statement, the statement that Reagan read right there, was then read in the Rose Garden as Reagan's official statement on the matter. Could you imagine, can anyone imagine Joe Biden sitting down and writing something that then becomes the official statement out of the White House? I mean, it's unfathomable. I mean, he's so aide-controlled that you just couldn't imagine that happening. And when he does go talk off the cuff, and we saw the clip about constitutional muster where he's talking about how the housing assistance thing wouldn't pass constitutional muster, but some scholars think it might, so he's going to pursue it anyway, even though he thinks it's unconstitutional. I mean, he just doesn't have the ability to articulate positions in the way Reagan could. And so I think part of it is a capability issue. I mean, does he have what Reagan had? And then the second is, does he have the willingness to confront tough actors? Does he want to take on the Iranians? Would he be willing to take on the unions? I really, really doubt that. So I think when you ask your question, which is an excellent one, you just got to put it in the context of, could Biden do these things, not should he do them?
Well, I think that we're talking about two very different men, too. I mean, Ronald Reagan was, people say, well, Ronald Reagan was an actor, he was a celebrity, and he sort of, had this, sort of bonhomie, which carried him into office. But what people forget is that Reagan did a lot of the groundwork over the decades prior to that in educating himself, in getting that philosophical discipline. He was a very educated person. A lot of that was autodidactic. And then he spent 2 terms as governor actually running a large state and demonstrating his executive abilities to do that. And I think that this is the point, Tevi, that a lot of people miss when they're looking at people who say, well, we need an outsider. Look at Reagan. He came in from the outside. Reagan came in from the outside initially, but Reagan was pretty well steeped in how to run public sector organizations by the time he got to the presidency, by the time he ran for the presidency. And even more than that, he was a very deep philosophical and ideological thinker. This is a guy who had a very broad and complex set of values that he wanted to put in place. And he was looking for opportunities to do this. I think when you're looking at other people who come in from the outside, they're generally more one note than that. And when you're looking at people like Joe Biden who come from the inside, they're so steeped in the bureaucracy and so tied to the various alliances that they've had to make to sustain their position in Washington, D.C., that they just don't have that same range of action. And that's the reason why I think that if you had a Patco and they went on strike today, Joe Biden wouldn't lift a finger about it.
Oh, that's absolutely clear. But the other great point you make there, Ed, is about Reagan and his reading. People really don't realize that Reagan was a very serious reader. He didn't highlight it. He didn't make a show of it. He didn't go to Martha's Vineyard and go to a bookstore every year like Obama used to do. But he was reading all the time. Nancy Reagan said when he would come home from trips, a bunch of books would kind of spill out of his suitcase because he was always reading. And he thought about these issues. And Hiram Skinner and the late Marty Anderson did this book about Reagan in his own hand that looked at Reagan's diaries and saw how carefully he thought about all these issues, including the issue of illegally striking government workers. And so when he wrote that statement that was read in the Rose Garden, this was an issue that he had carefully thought about before. He wasn't just showing up and wondering whether housing assistance passes constitutional muster. These are issues that he had deeply engaged with, and he knew what he thought, and I think that was part of Reagan's strength.
And we're speaking with Tevi Troy, historian and author, at Tevi Troy on Twitter. Just briefly, got about 30 seconds here. There was a clip going around with Reagan interacting with, I forget who the 2 newsmen were, and speaking extemporaneously. He was 76 years old, so he's only a couple of years younger than Joe Biden is now. And people were saying, it's amazing to look at this and then to try to imagine Joe Biden in the same position. And that really doesn't have anything to do with age. That has to do with the type of experience and capability that Ronald Reagan put into this, the type of preparation. Tevi, I'm sorry, we ran out of time. Tevi Troy, be sure to read this piece at the Washington Examiner. It's fantastic. I'm Ed Morrissey of Hugh Hewitt, filling in for Hugh Hewitt. We'll be right back.